It was a sunny afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of day where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Families strolled along sidewalks, children laughed as they played with their bikes, and the scent of freshly mowed grass hung in the air. But for two young black girls walking home from the park, this peaceful scene was about to be shattered. They had no idea that within moments, their lives would take a dramatic and dangerous turn that would leave an entire community questioning everything they thought they knew. The girls, no older than 12 or 13, were laughing and chatting, carrying their backpacks and snacks from the park. They were best friends, practically inseparable, always watching out for each other. Their bond was evident in the way they shared jokes and traded stories, completely at ease in their little world. But as they crossed the street toward a corner store, a black police cruiser slowly rolled up behind them, its presence quiet but intimidating. The officer inside, a stern-looking man with a sharp uniform and a hardened gaze, was already sizing them up as if they were criminals. He didn't announce himself at first, simply pulling the car alongside the curb and watching. The girls noticed him but didn't think much of it. After all, they weren't doing anything wrong, just walking home like they had 100 times before. But then came the abrupt blare of the siren, startling them both. The officer's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Hey, you two! Stop right there!" Confused, the girls froze in their tracks, glancing at each other with wide eyes. They turned to face the officer, their innocent expressions masking the rising fear in their hearts. "What's going on, sir?" one of them asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You match the description of some suspects we're looking for," the officer barked, stepping out of the car and walking toward them. His tone was accusatory, his body language aggressive. "Empty your pockets. Let me see what you're carrying." The girls exchanged nervous glances. They knew they hadn't done anything wrong, but the weight of the officer's words made them feel guilty for reasons they couldn't explain. "We just came from the park," one of them said quietly, reaching for her pocket. "We don't have anything, just our phones and snacks." "Don't talk back to me," the officer snapped, cutting her off. He grabbed one of the girls' backpacks without asking and began rummaging through it. His actions were rough, invasive, and without a shred of respect. The girls stood frozen, their hearts pounding as they watched him toss their belongings onto the pavement. It was clear the officer wasn't looking for anything specific. This was about something else: power, control, maybe even something darker. He seemed to revel in their fear, smirking as he accused them of things that didn't make sense. "What are you doing out here anyway? Skipping school? Selling something you shouldn't be?" "We're just going home," the other girl stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. "We didn't do anything wrong. Please, just let us go." But the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he pulled out his handcuffs and grabbed one of the girls by the wrist. "You're coming with me," he said coldly, ignoring her protests. "Both of you." The scene was escalating quickly, and a small crowd had begun to gather nearby. Passers-by whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The tension was palpable, the air thick with disbelief and outrage. Yet no one dared to step forward, fearing they might become the officer's next target. As the girls were led toward the cruiser, their hands cuffed and tears streaming down their faces, one of them turned to the crowd, pleading, "Please, somebody help us. We didn't do anything." It was a cry that struck a chord with everyone watching, but it wasn't until an older man, a retired veteran who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, stepped forward that the situation began to shift. "Officer," he said firmly, his voice calm but authoritative, "what exactly are you arresting these kids for? They're just children." "Stay out of it, old man," the officer snapped, his grip tightening on the girl's arms. "This is none of your business." But the man didn't back down. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on the officer with a quiet determination. "It is my business," he said. "This is my community, and these girls are my neighbors. If they've done something wrong, then tell us. Otherwise, let them go." The officer hesitated, clearly annoyed by the man's defiance. But before he could respond, something unexpected happened. One of the bystanders, a young woman who had been recording the whole thing, spoke up. "I've got this all on video," she said loudly. "And I'm live streaming it. If you don't have a valid reason for arresting them, everyone's going to see this." The officer's face turned red, a mix of anger and panic flashing in his eyes. He glanced around at the crowd, which had grown larger and more vocal. People were demanding answers, shouting at him to let the girls go. The once quiet street had turned into a scene of chaos and confrontation, and it was clear the officer was losing control of the narrative. But then, in a twist no one saw coming, the officer's radio crackled to life. "We have an emergency situation at the east side of town," a dispatcher's voice said urgently. "Officer required immediately. Back up en route." The officer paused, his grip on the girls loosening slightly. For a moment, he seemed torn between his desire to assert his authority and the need to respond to the call. But before he could make a decision, the veteran stepped forward again, this time placing a hand on the officer's shoulder. "Go handle the real emergency," he said firmly. "We'll make sure these girls get home safely. You've done enough here." The officer glared at him, his jaw clenched, but he knew he was outnumbered and out of time. With a frustrated grunt, he released the girls and stormed back to his cruiser. The crowd erupted into cheers as the girls were freed, though their relief was short-lived. The officer sped off toward the emergency, leaving behind a shaken community and two young girls who would never forget the fear they felt that day. But this was far from over. The officer's hasty retreat wasn't the end of his troubles, it was only the beginning. Little did he know, the emergency he was rushing to would turn the tables in a way he could never have imagined. Within minutes, he would find himself in a situation so dire, so desperate, that the very people he had just humiliated would be the ones he'd have to turn to for help. And when that moment came, the question wouldn't be whether they could help him, it would be whether they would. The officer gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he sped through the streets toward the east side of town. His mind was racing, but not for the reasons it should have been. The radio dispatch had mentioned something about a major disturbance, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the crowd and those two girls. The veteran's words, the young woman filming, the accusing stares, it all gnawed at him. He clenched his jaw, trying to shake off the discomfort. He was just doing his job, wasn't he? Yet deep down, a flicker of doubt began to take root. Maybe he had overstepped. Maybe he'd let his frustration, his assumptions, cloud his judgment. But there wasn't time to dwell on it now. The dispatcher's voice crackled again, this time more urgent. "All units, we need immediate assistance. Repeat, immediate assistance." As he approached the scene, the chaos was impossible to miss. Smoke billowed into the sky, and the sound of sirens filled the air. People were running in all directions, their faces etched with fear. He slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the cruiser, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio. "This is Officer 27, on site. What's the situation?" The dispatcher's reply was muffled by static. "Reports of an explosion. Possibly related to unknown individuals in the area. Proceed with caution." The officer's stomach twisted as he scanned the scene. A storefront had been blown open, debris scattered across the street. A few people were injured, sitting on the curb with makeshift bandages wrapped around their arms and legs. Others were shouting, pointing toward an alleyway at the far end of the block. But it wasn't the damage or the chaos that made his heart pound. It was the shadowy figures disappearing into the alley fast, organized, and clearly up to no good. Without a second thought, he radioed for backup and began running in their direction, his boots crunching over broken glass. As he entered the alley, the air grew colder, the walls on either side looming high and cutting off the sunlight. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made his skin crawl. His breathing was heavy, his senses on high alert. He could feel eyes on him, though he couldn't see anyone. "Police!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "Come out with your hands up." There was no response, just the faint sound of footsteps growing more distant. He quickened his pace, his flashlight cutting through the dimness. The alley twisted and turned like a maze, and for a moment, he thought he might have lost them. But then he saw fresh footprints in a patch of dirt, leading toward a metal door slightly ajar. The officer hesitated, his hand hovering over his holster. Every instinct told him this was a bad idea, but he couldn't back down now. He pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading underground. The air was damp and stale, carrying a metallic tang that made his stomach churn. He descended cautiously, his heart pounding louder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs was a dimly lit room, cluttered with crates and wires. It looked like some sort of makeshift lab or workshop. There were papers scattered everywhere, diagrams and notes that made no sense to him. But what caught his attention was the sound of a voice, a low, hurried whisper coming from the corner. He moved closer, his flashlight revealing a figure hunched over a desk. It was a man, middle-aged, with a wild look in his eyes. He seemed oblivious to the officer's presence, muttering to himself as he fiddled with a device that looked disturbingly like an explosive. "Freeze!" the officer shouted, his voice breaking the tension like a thunderclap. The man jumped, spinning around to face him. His hands shot up, but his expression wasn't one of fear, it was one of defiance. "You have no idea what you've walked into," the man said, his voice calm but menacing. "You think you're in control, but you're not." The officer's grip tightened on his weapon. "Step away from the table." "Now." But the man didn't move. Instead, he smiled, a cold, unsettling grin that sent a shiver down the officer's spine. "It's too late," he said. "You can't stop what's coming." Before the officer could respond, a loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Backup had arrived, but so had someone else, someone who wasn't on his side. The officer turned toward the stairs, his mind racing. He was trapped, caught between the unknown threat upstairs and the man in front of him. "What's coming?" he demanded, turning back to the man. But the room was empty. The man was gone, vanished as if he'd never been there. The only thing left behind was the device on the table, its wires glowing faintly. Panic surged through him as he reached for his radio. "This is Officer 27. I need immediate assistance. Possible explosive device in the basement. Repeat, possible explosive device." The response was immediate but garbled, the chaos upstairs interfering with the signal. He looked back at the device, his training kicking in. He wasn't an expert, but he knew enough to recognize that this thing was active, and he didn't have much time. As he worked to disarm it, the sounds upstairs grew louder. There were shouts, gunfire, and the unmistakable sound of someone crying out in pain. The officer's hands trembled as he worked, his focus split between the device and the chaos above. And then it happened. The device let out a sharp beep, followed by a flash of light. For a split second, he thought it was over, but the explosion didn't come. Instead, the device powered down, its lights fading to black. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The footsteps were coming closer, heavy and deliberate. He turned toward the stairs, his weapon at the ready, but what he saw froze him in place. It wasn't backup. It wasn't even the man he'd seen earlier. It was something else, something that didn't belong. The officer's breath caught in his throat as he realized the nightmare he'd walked into wasn't just about an explosion or a shadowy figure in an alley. This was bigger. And it wasn't just his life on the line anymore. The officer stood frozen, his eyes locked on the figure at the top of the stairs. It wasn't the man from the basement, nor was it someone he recognized from his unit. This figure moved differently, with an eerie calmness that didn't match the chaos unfolding above. Shadows seemed to cling to it, making it hard to see clearly in the dim light. Every instinct in his body screamed danger, but he couldn't look away. A low voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come here." The officer tightened his grip on his weapon, forcing himself to focus. "Identify yourself." "Hands where I can see them." But the figure didn't comply. Instead, it began descending the stairs slowly, deliberately, each step echoing in the confined space. The officer felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of the moment made it impossible. Above them, the sounds of fighting grew louder. Shouts mixed with heavy footsteps, and every now and then, something heavy crashed to the floor. Whoever or whatever had arrived upstairs wasn't letting up, and the officer knew his window to act was closing fast. "Stay back," he barked, his voice cracking slightly. "I will fire if I have to." The figure stopped mid-step, tilting its head as if amused. "You think your weapon will help you?" The voice was cold and measured, with a strange edge that made it hard to tell if it belonged to a man or woman. The officer's pulse was racing now. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be in control, enforcing order, but every second in this basement chipped away at that illusion. He took a step back, his eyes darting toward the now deactivated device on the table. Was this figure connected to the man he'd seen earlier? And what about those girls? He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was linked, but how? The figure moved again, quicker this time, closing the distance with alarming speed. The officer raised his weapon instinctively, his finger hovering over the trigger. "I said stay back," he shouted again. But before he could act, a deafening roar erupted from upstairs. The walls shook, dust falling from the ceiling as the sound reverberated through the room. The officer stumbled, his focus momentarily broken. When he looked back, the figure was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. Panic surged through him. He wasn't sure if he should go back up the stairs or stay where he was. Both options seemed equally dangerous. His radio crackled to life, static mixed with fragmented voices. "Officer down, need backup." East entrance compromised. The officer swallowed hard. Whatever was happening upstairs, it wasn't just a simple disturbance anymore. He had to act, but every move felt like a gamble. He glanced at the table again, the scattered notes and diagrams catching his eye. Among the mess, one page stood out, a crude map with markings he couldn't decipher. At the center of it, circled and underlined, was a single word: justice. His chest tightened. Was this some kind of manifesto? A warning? He didn't have time to figure it out. The sounds upstairs were growing closer, and he could hear the unmistakable clink of heavy boots descending the stairs. This time, it wasn't just one person. The officer backed into a corner, his weapon trained on the stairwell. His mind raced through every possible scenario, but none of them ended well. He was outnumbered, out of his depth, and completely in the dark about what was happening. Then, like a switch flipping, the noise stopped. The footsteps halted halfway down the stairs, and for a moment, the silence was even more terrifying than the chaos. The officer's breathing was shallow, his finger trembling on the trigger. He strained his ears, trying to pick up any sound, any clue about what was coming next. "Officer," a voice called out, startling him. It was a man's voice, calm and measured. "We don't want any trouble. But you need to come with us." The officer hesitated. "Who are you? What do you want?" There was a pause, and then the voice replied, "Answers. Just like you." It didn't make sense. How could they know what he was thinking? He was about to demand more when a second voice chimed in, this one female. "You've seen too much now. You can either help us or be left behind." The officer's stomach dropped. Left behind? What did that mean? His thoughts flashed to the two girls he'd detained earlier. Could they be connected to this? He hadn't given them a second thought at the time, but now their words echoed in his mind. You don't know what's really going on. His grip on his weapon faltered. He didn't trust these people, but he couldn't deny that he was in over his head. Slowly, cautiously, he called out, I'll come. But I'm not putting my weapon down. The voices didn't argue. Instead, the footsteps resumed, descending the stairs until two figures came into view. They were dressed in plain, dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by masks. They didn't look like gang members or petty criminals. If anything, they seemed professional. One of them, the man, gestured toward the stairs. We need to move. Now. They'll be here any second. They? The officer asked, his voice sharp. The woman glanced toward the door. You really don't know, do you? It's bigger than you think. Before he could press further, another explosion rocked the building. The lights flickered, plunging the basement into darkness for a split second before the emergency lights kicked in. The officer stumbled, his sense of direction thrown off. The man grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the stairs. No time. You'll understand soon enough. The officer resisted for a moment, but the urgency in the man's voice left him no choice. Together, they hurried up the stairs and into the chaos above. The scene was worse than he'd imagined. Smoke filled the air, and flashes of light illuminated figures moving through the wreckage, figures that didn't look entirely human. The officer's mind reeled. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but one thing was clear: whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet. The smoke was thick, stinging the officer's eyes and making it hard to breathe. He stumbled forward, clutching his weapon tightly as chaos unfolded around him. Figures darted in and out of the haze, their movements swift and unrelenting. The officer struggled to tell friend from foe. Every few seconds, flashes of light illuminated the destruction, revealing shattered furniture, crumbled walls, and deep scorch marks on the floor. Keep moving! The man shouted over his shoulder, urging the officer forward. The urgency in his voice made it clear they weren't safe yet. The woman ran ahead of them, scanning the area with precision, her movements calculated and deliberate. She seemed to know exactly where to go, as if she'd been here before. As they navigated through the wreckage, the officer's thoughts raced. Nothing about this made sense. The figures he'd glimpsed through the smoke, what were they? And why did they move like that, faster and more fluidly than any human he'd seen? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in something far bigger than he could comprehend. Suddenly, the woman skidded to a halt, holding up a hand to signal the others to stop. She crouched low, her head tilted as if listening for something. The officer tried to steady his breathing, his ears straining to pick up whatever had caught her attention. At first, he heard nothing but the distant sounds of destruction. Then, faintly, there it was, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate through the floor. The woman cursed under her breath. They've activated it. The man's expression darkened. We're out of time. Activated what? The officer demanded, his frustration boiling over. He was done being kept in the dark. What's going on? Who are they? The woman shot him a sharp look. You'll get your answers if we survive the next 5 minutes. Now move! Before he could argue, the hum grew louder, more insistent. The ground beneath them began to shake, and the air seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. The officer instinctively reached out to steady himself against a broken wall, but the moment his hand touched it, a sharp jolt shot up his arm, forcing him to pull back with a yelp. The wall was pulsing, as if it were alive. What is this? He gasped, his voice barely audible over the noise. The man grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. We told you, it's bigger than you think. Now keep moving, or you'll end up like them. Them? The officer turned his head, his eyes scanning the room until he spotted what the man was referring to. In the corner of the room, partially obscured by debris, were two motionless figures. At first, he thought they were injured civilians, but as he drew closer, a cold dread settled over him. Their skin was gray, almost metallic, and their eyes were wide open, unblinking, glowing faintly in the dim light. They weren't alive, but they weren't entirely dead, either. The officer's stomach churned. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. What? What did that to them? The woman answered without turning around. The same thing that'll happen to all of us if we don't stop it. Her words sent a chill down his spine. He followed them through the smoke, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. They moved quickly, weaving through the destruction until they reached a heavy steel door, partially hidden behind a collapsed section of the wall. The woman knelt by the control panel, her fingers moving swiftly over the keys. Hurry, the man urged, his eyes darting nervously back the way they'd come. They're getting closer. The officer looked over his shoulder, half expecting to see those strange figures emerging from the smoke. Instead, he saw something far worse. The smoke was shifting, moving unnaturally, as if it were alive. Shapes began to form within it, dark, hulking shapes that didn't quite make sense. Their outlines flickered and warped, making it impossible to tell where they began and ended. And their eyes bright, piercing, and inhuman cut through the haze like headlights. We have to go now, the officer shouted, his voice tinged with panic. The woman didn't look up. Almost there. Just keep them back. The man stepped forward, pulling a sleek, unfamiliar weapon from his belt. It wasn't standard issue, not even close. He aimed it at the advancing figures and fired. A blinding blue light erupted from the barrel, cutting through the smoke and striking one of the shapes. The figure let out a bone-chilling screech and dissolved into the air, but more were coming, their movements faster and more erratic. The officer raised his own weapon, his hands shaking as he aimed. He fired a shot, but it went wide, the bullet disappearing uselessly into the smoke. His training felt useless here. These weren't ordinary criminals, they weren't even human. He fired again, this time hitting one of the shapes, but it barely flinched, its glowing eyes locking onto him with terrifying intensity. Got it! The woman shouted. The steel door hissed open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Go! The man yelled, firing another shot to cover their retreat. The officer didn't need to be told twice. He bolted through the door, practically tumbling down the stairs in his haste. The woman followed close behind, and the man brought up the rear, slamming the door shut behind them. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. The officer leaned against the wall, trying to process what had just happened. His hands were trembling, and his mind was racing with unanswered questions. What were those things? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman looked at him, her expression grim. They're the reason we're here. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want. And what's that? She hesitated, glancing at the man before answering. Control. Over everything. Her words hung heavy in the air. The officer wanted to press her for more, but before he could, the hum returned. This time, it was louder, closer, and more menacing. The walls around them began to glow faintly, pulsing with the same unnatural energy he'd felt earlier. They found us, the man said, his voice low. The woman nodded, pulling a small device from her pocket. Then it's time to level the playing field. Before the officer could ask what she meant, she pressed a button on the device. A low beep echoed through the corridor, followed by a sound that made his blood run cold. A voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from all around them. Release the hostages, the voice said, smooth and mechanical. Surrender now, and we may consider mercy. The officer's heart sank. He didn't know who or what was speaking, but he knew one thing for certain: mercy wasn't an option. The corridor seemed to close in around them as the pulsing hum grew deafening. The officer's chest tightened, his instincts screaming that they were out of time. The man and the woman exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. She held the device tightly, her finger hovering over a different button. "What are you doing?" the officer asked, panic rising in his voice. "Finishing this," she replied, her tone unwavering. The man stepped closer to the officer, his voice steady but low. "You need to trust us now. No more questions, no more hesitation. If we don't act, it's over for all of us." Before the officer could respond, the steel door they had come through began to buckle, dents forming as if something massive was pounding against it. Each hit sent a jarring vibration through the walls. The glowing light around them intensified, casting eerie shadows that danced wildly in the dim space. "Whatever you're doing, you'd better do it now," the officer urged, his voice trembling. The woman pressed the button, and suddenly, the corridor was bathed in a blinding light. A sharp, high-pitched sound erupted, making the officer cover his ears. The walls around them began to shimmer, the strange energy dissipating into thin air. The pounding on the steel door stopped abruptly, replaced by an unnatural silence. "What? What just happened?" the officer stammered, his ears still ringing. The woman didn't answer immediately. She stared at the device in her hand, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "It's a temporary disruption. They'll regroup quickly, but it bought us a window." The man nodded. "Enough time to reach the core." "The core?" the officer echoed. "What core? What are you talking about?" "It's the source of all this," the woman explained, her voice tight with urgency. "The energy, the creatures, the control they're trying to exert, it all stems from one place. If we can destroy it, we can end this." The officer hesitated, his mind racing. Every part of him wanted to demand more answers, to make sense of the madness unfolding around him. But as he looked at the determination on their faces, he realized they weren't lying. They believed in what they were doing, and for better or worse, he was caught in the middle of it. "Fine," he said finally. "Let's do it." They moved quickly, the woman leading the way with the man close behind. The officer brought up the rear, his eyes darting nervously to every shadow. The corridor twisted and turned, descending deeper into the building. The further they went, the colder it became, the air thick with a metallic tang. At last, they reached another heavy door, this one adorned with strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly. The woman paused, studying the symbols carefully before placing her hand on the center of the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan, the door slid open, revealing a vast chamber bathed in a pulsating blue light. The officer's breath caught in his throat. In the center of the chamber was a massive, crystalline structure, its jagged edges refracting the light in mesmerizing patterns. It pulsed rhythmically, the hum they'd been hearing emanating from its core. Surrounding it were several of the shadowy figures they'd encountered earlier, their movements slow and deliberate as if they were guarding the structure. "That's it," the woman whispered. "The core. How do we destroy it?" the officer asked, his voice barely audible. The man pulled a small, cylindrical device from his belt. "This. It's an energy destabilizer. Once it's activated, the core will collapse in on itself." "And what happens to us when that happens?" the officer pressed, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. The man didn't answer, his silence speaking volumes. The woman turned to the officer, her expression softening. "We don't have another choice. If we don't stop it, the whole city, maybe even the whole world, will be consumed." The officer's throat tightened. He looked at the crystalline structure, then back at the shadowy figures guarding it. He felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness, but also a flicker of determination. If they were willing to risk everything, the least he could do was stand by them. "Let's finish this," he said, gripping his weapon tightly. The man nodded and began moving toward the core, staying low to avoid drawing attention. The woman and the officer followed closely, their movements careful and deliberate. They were halfway across the chamber when one of the shadowy figures turned, its glowing eyes locking onto them. "Go!" the woman shouted, raising her weapon and firing a burst of blue light at the figure. The shot hit its mark, but the creature barely staggered. It let out a deafening roar, and suddenly, all the other figures turned toward them, their eyes blazing with fury. The officer fired his weapon, his shots doing little more than slowing the creatures down. The man reached the core, the device in his hands glowing faintly as he began to set it up. The woman covered him, firing relentlessly at the advancing figures. "Hurry!" she yelled, her voice strained. The officer's heart pounded as he fired shot after shot, the creatures closing in despite their efforts. Just as one of them lunged at him, a blinding light erupted from the core, throwing the creature back. The man stood over the device, his face set with grim determination. "It's ready!" he shouted. "We've got 60 seconds, get to the exit." The woman grabbed the officer's arm, pulling him toward the door. He stumbled after her, his legs feeling like lead. The creatures gave chase, their movements more frantic than ever. The officer glanced over his shoulder and saw the man still standing by the core, holding the creatures at bay. "Wait, what about him?" the officer cried. The woman didn't look back. "He knows what he's doing. Keep moving!" They reached the corridor just as a deafening roar echoed behind them. The ground shook violently, and a wave of heat surged through the air, nearly knocking them off their feet. The officer turned to look, but the woman pushed him forward. "Don't stop!" she yelled. They ran as fast as they could, the building collapsing around them. The officer's lungs burned, his legs screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. Finally, they burst out into the open air, collapsing onto the ground just as the building behind them imploded in a massive explosion of light and sound. For a moment, everything was silent. The officer lay on his back, staring up at the sky, his chest heaving. The woman sat beside him, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Did we do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't answer. She stared at the ruins of the building, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The officer followed her gaze, his heart sinking as he realized what she was thinking. The man hadn't made it out. Before he could say anything, a faint noise caught their attention. It was coming from the ruins, a low, rhythmic hum. The officer's blood ran cold. "No," he breathed. "That's not possible." The woman's eyes widened in horror as the hum grew louder, the ground beneath them beginning to vibrate once more. From the wreckage, a faint blue light began to glow, pulsing steadily. "It's not over," she said, her voice barely audible. The officer stared at the light, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. Whatever they had done, it hadn't been enough. And as the hum grew louder, he realized with a chilling certainty that their fight was far from finished. The blue light shimmered in the ruins, defying every expectation. The officer could barely breathe as he watched it pulse, slower than before but undeniably present. The woman stood motionless, her fists clenched, her face pale with exhaustion and disbelief. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with the weight of failure. "We need to leave," the officer said quietly, breaking the silence. "It's not safe here." The woman shook her head, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and determination. "No. I'm not running again. Not this time." He wanted to argue, but he saw it in her eyes, a resolve that wasn't going to waver. She had lost too much already, sacrificed too much to walk away now. Against his better judgment, he nodded, silently agreeing to stand with her, even if it meant the end. The humming grew louder, and the faint blue light began to intensify, sending streaks of energy arcing through the rubble. The officer stepped forward cautiously, his weapon raised, though he doubted it would make much difference. The woman followed, holding her device close as if searching for a solution hidden within its mechanics. As they neared the ruins, a faint, distorted sound broke through the hum of voice, though not one they could fully understand. It was garbled, alien, almost mournful. The officer exchanged a glance with the woman, both of them frozen in place as the voice grew clearer. Help. Stop. Cycle. The words came in bursts, fragmented and strained, but they were unmistakably a plea. The officer's grip on his weapon tightened as confusion and fear warred within him. Is it talking to us? The woman didn't respond immediately. Her eyes darted between the glowing core and the surrounding rubble, piecing together what was happening. I don't think it's them, she said slowly, her voice laced with unease. I think it's something trapped inside. The officer frowned, struggling to make sense of her words. Trapped? What do you mean? She gestured toward the core, which was now flickering erratically, the arcs of energy less controlled than before. This isn't just a machine. It's alive, some kind of entity, maybe even sentient. And I think it's trying to break free. His heart raced as her words sank in. If she was right, everything they'd been fighting against wasn't just some malicious force, it was a prison for something far more complex. But whether that made it an ally or an even greater threat, he couldn't say. What do we do? He asked, his voice low. The woman stared at the device in her hands, her expression pained. We have to finish what we started. But if we destroy the core completely, it might die along with it. The officer's stomach churned. Every instinct screamed at him to play it safe, to eliminate the threat and walk away. But as he looked at the glowing light, heard the faint voice begging for help, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at stake than they understood. Can we help it without risking everything? He asked, his tone cautious but hopeful. The woman hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know. But if we don't try, we'll never know. Before he could argue, she stepped forward, raising the device in her hand. The core responded immediately, the light flaring brighter, as if recognizing her presence. The humming shifted, becoming almost melodic, a sound that resonated deep in their chests. The officer watched helplessly as she began pressing buttons on the device, the arcs of energy around the core growing wilder with each adjustment. He wanted to stop her, to insist they leave, but something in the air held him back, a strange sense of trust, of inevitability. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the woman worked, her face a mask of concentration. The officer kept his weapon trained on the shadows around them, half expecting the creatures to reappear at any moment. But the ruins remained still, the only movement coming from the pulsing core. Finally, the woman stepped back, her hands shaking. It's done, she said softly. What did you do? The officer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened it, she replied, her eyes fixed on the core. Now it's up to whatever's inside. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The light continued to pulse, the hum growing quieter, more rhythmic. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, the core split open, releasing a wave of energy that washed over them like a warm breeze. The officer shielded his eyes, expecting chaos, destruction, anything but what came next. When he looked again, the core was gone, replaced by a shimmering figure of light. It hovered above the ruins, its form shifting and fluid, almost too bright to look at directly. Thank you, the voice said, no longer garbled but clear and resonant. The officer took a cautious step back, his weapon lowered but still ready. What? What are you? The figure seemed to regard him, though it had no eyes or discernible features. A fragment, it said simply, of what once was and what could be again. The woman stepped forward, her expression a mixture of awe and curiosity. Why were you trapped? To protect, the figure replied. And to be protected. But the cycle must end. The officer frowned, frustration bubbling to the surface. What cycle? What does any of this mean? The figure tilted its head, as if considering how to answer. The balance has been disrupted, it said. You have the power to restore it, but only if you choose. The woman exchanged a glance with the officer, her brow furrowed. How do we restore it? By trusting, the figure replied. And by letting go. Before they could ask more, the figure began to fade, its light dimming until it was little more than a faint glow in the air. The humming ceased, replaced by a profound silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. The officer lowered his weapon fully, his shoulders slumping. What just happened? The woman didn't answer immediately. She stared at the empty space where the figure had been, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to him, a small, tired smile on her lips. I think we just saved more than we'll ever understand. They stood there for a long moment, the ruins around them eerily still. The officer felt a strange sense of calm, as if a storm had finally passed. Whatever had been unleashed, he knew it wasn't something they could fully comprehend. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. As they made their way back to the surface, the woman glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. You know, she said, you didn't have to stay. You could have walked away at any time. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I guess I figured if you were crazy enough to see this through, the least I could do was back you up. She laughed softly, the sound cutting through the lingering tension like sunlight after a storm. Well, I'm glad you did. When they finally emerged into the open air, the city stretched out before them, eerily quiet but intact. The officer took a deep breath, the weight on his chest lifting slightly. Whatever came next, he knew they'd face it together. And for now, that was enough.